Salmetik. Why are you here? The voice, sharp and dripping with condescending amusement, cut through the low hum of the processing center. Commander Davies, a man whose uniform seemed to carry more starch than his character, tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the form in front of him. His eyes, small and critical, scanned the woman standing before his desk, a public appraisal designed for maximum humiliation. This is the pre-deployment screening for Task Force Neptune, Petty Officer, not the annual dental checkup for the base library staff. Someone in admin must have made a serious clerical error. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the long line of sailors and Marines behind her, the sound of men eager to align themselves with authority and distance themselves from the target of its scorn. The crowd laughed. They saw what the commander saw, a woman of slight build, her frame almost lost in her neatly pressed but visibly worn Navy working uniform. Her hair was pulled back in a severe regulation bun, revealing a face that was more focused than memorable, a face that didn't advertise its history. She held a standard-issue records jacket in her hands, her posture relaxed but not slumped, a study in quiet neutrality. She offered no reaction to the insult. Her gaze remained fixed on a point just over the commander's shoulder, her expression as placid as a deep-water harbor. There was no flash of anger in her eyes, no tightening of the jaw, no defensive retort. There was only a profound and unnerving stillness, a silence that seemed to absorb the commander's arrogance and render it impotent. This silence was her first act of defiance, a refusal to participate in the petty drama he was trying to stage. But when the Admiral, standing in the corner of the vast room on an unannounced inspection, saw her stance, he didn't see a clerk. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of weight to the balls of her feet, the way her eyes weren't vacant, but were instead methodically scanning the room's exits and population, a constant, low-level threat assessment buried deep in her muscle memory. The Admiral saw a ghost he recognized from a world far from this sterile bureaucracy. The commander, blind to these nuances, saw only what his prejudice allowed. He was a gatekeeper, a man whose power was derived from paperwork and regulations, and this woman's presence was an anomaly that offended his rigid sense of order. He delighted in correcting such errors, loudly and publicly. He was about to learn a lesson that would be seared into the institutional memory of the entire naval base, a lesson about the vast, dangerous gulf between assumption and reality. This quiet petty officer was a crucible, and Commander Davies had just willingly stepped into the fire, completely unaware of the searing heat he was about to face. The sterile, fluorescent-lit hall, with its scent of floor wax and recycled air, was his kingdom, but he was merely a court jester who had just insulted the silent queen. If you believe that true strength is measured in actions, not announcements, type competence below. Commander Davies pressed his attack, mistaking her silence for weakness, for intimidated compliance. "Let me be clearer, petty officer," he continued, his voice rising in volume, ensuring everyone in the cavernous hall could hear his magnanimous correction. Task Force Neptune is an elite unit. It's comprised of special operations personnel, SEALs, EOD, SWCC, the tip of the spear. The work is physically demanding. He let the words hang in the air, a verbal underline on his condescension. You appear to have checked the box for Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewman Medical Support. Are you sure you didn't mean to check the box for Logistics and Supply Clerk? He smiled, a thin, predatory smirk. It's an easy mistake to make. The acronyms can be confusing for people who aren't familiar. He was enjoying this, performing for the audience of operators who were waiting in line, men whose formidable physiques and hardened expressions seemed to validate his biased worldview. He was reinforcing the established order, the visible hierarchy of strength. The woman before him, Petty Officer Morgan, simply blinked. Once, a slow, deliberate motion. She then lowered her gaze from the wall behind him to the form on his desk. Her finger, unadorned and steady, traced the line to the box she had checked. She then looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. Her own eyes were in neutral gray, and they held his for a moment without a flicker of subservience or fear. "No, sir," she said. Her voice was low, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a simple statement of fact, carrying no challenge, yet it was the most profound act of opposition the commander had faced all day. The simplicity of her denial, her refusal to be flustered or provoked, seemed to anger him more than any argument could have. It was as if she was operating on a different frequency, one he couldn't access or jam. He saw defiance where there was only discipline. He saw insubordination where there was only an unwavering adherence to the truth. Her hands, resting on the counter, were a testament to this discipline. They were not the soft, manicured hands of a clerk. They were competent, the knuckles slightly calloused, the nails clipped short and clean. They were the hands of a person who worked with tools, whether those tools were a keyboard, a rifle, or a scalpel. They were still, patient, waiting. They were the hands of a professional, and in their placid stillness, they held more potential energy than all the commander's blustering and posturing. He was about to demand her service record, to expose her lie and publicly shame her, when a choked gasp came from the back of the line, followed by a heavy, sickening thud. The carefully constructed order of the room shattered in an instant. The thud was followed by a collective shout. The line of hardened warriors broke apart as men rushed toward the source of the commotion. On the cold, polished linoleum floor, a Master Chief Petty Officer lay convulsing. He was a legend on the base, a man who had served for 30 years, his face a roadmap of deployments and hard-won wisdom. Now, that face was turning a terrifying shade of blue, his lips purpling, his breath coming in ragged, high-pitched whistles. It was stridor, the sound of a closing airway. Panic, a virus far more contagious than any pathogen, began to spread through the room. A young corpsman, no older than 20, rushed forward with a medical kit, but froze, his eyes wide with terror, his training evaporating in the face of a real-world crisis of this magnitude. Others shouted for a gurney, for an ambulance, for someone, anyone, to do something. Commander Davies, for all his authoritative bluster, was useless. He stood half-risen from his chair, his face pale, barking contradictory orders that only added to the chaos. Someone get a doctor. Call 911. Clear the area. His authority, so absolute moments before, was revealed to be a hollow shell, a costume for a man who commanded desks, not crises. Amidst this swirling vortex of fear and confusion, Petty Officer Morgan moved. She didn't run. She didn't shout. Her movement was an act of pure, fluid economy. She flowed through the panicked crowd, not by pushing, but by finding the natural gaps, a phantom slipping through a storm. Time seemed to bifurcate. For everyone else, it was a frantic, terrifying blur. For Morgan, it slowed to a crawl. She saw the scene not as chaos, but as a clinical problem set with a rapidly closing window for a solution. She saw the Master Chief's cyanosis, the tracheal tugging, the intercostal retractions. She heard the stridor not as a sound of dying, but as a diagnostic data point. Anaphylaxis. Severe. Airway compromise imminent. She was already at the Master Chief's side before the young corpsman had even managed to open his kit. Her hands went to work, a blur of practiced, methodical grace. She checked for a pulse, strong but thready. She tilted his head back, attempting to open the airway, but the wheezing only grew louder, more desperate. The epiglottis was swelling shut. He had seconds. Her eyes scanned the room, not for help, but for tools. The medical kit was standard issue, inadequate for this. No advanced airway equipment. No scalpel. No time. Her gaze landed on the commander's desk. She saw his nameplate, his perfectly aligned pens, his pristine blotter. And she saw the solution. In 2 quick strides, she was there. She didn't ask. She took. Her left hand swept up a heavy-duty ballpoint pen. Her right hand, moving with a speed that seemed impossible, plucked the small, razor-sharp letter opener from its stand. Davy sputtered, "What do you think you're?" But the words died in his throat as he saw the look in her eyes. The quiet, placid clerk was gone. In her place was a predator, a being of absolute focus and lethal intent. There was no malice in her expression, only an icy, diamond-hard concentration that was more terrifying than any rage. She was back beside the Master Chief in a heartbeat. "Someone hold his head. Steady," she commanded, and her voice, though still low, was infused with an authority that was absolute. Two burly SEALs, their own faces etched with fear for their mentor, immediately knelt and complied without question. They recognized the tone. It was the voice of someone who had given orders in the hell of combat, a voice that cut through fear. With the pen, she palpated the Master Chief's throat, her fingers finding the cricothyroid membrane with the certainty of a master sculptor. It was a precise, tactile knowledge born from countless hours of training on mannequins, and whispered the darkest corners of her file, on casualties in the dust of forgotten war zones. Then, she raised the letter opener. The room held its collective breath. The polished steel blade, a tool for opening envelopes, flashed under the fluorescent lights. There was no hesitation, no tremor in her hand. She drove the point down, a swift, precise, and brutally efficient incision. She twisted the blade to open the airway, then shoved the hollowed-out casing of the ballpoint pen into the opening. The sound was obscene, a wet, violating puncture, but it was immediately followed by a sound that was glorious, the blessed, beautiful hiss of air being drawn into starving lungs. A collective gasp swept the room. It was a sound of shock, of awe, of profound, unadulterated respect. The Master Chief's violent convulsions subsided. The terrifying blue tint of his skin began to recede, replaced by a healthier, pinker hue. He was breathing, raggedly, horribly, through a plastic tube sticking out his neck, but he was breathing. The immediate crisis was over, and in the deafening silence that followed, a silence broken only by that ragged breathing, every single eye in the room was fixed on the small, quiet woman kneeling on the floor, her hands now calmly monitoring the Master Chief's pulse, her face once again a mask of professional calm. The commander's arrogant words echoed in the minds of all who had heard them. "C'est militarystories. Why are you here?" The answer was now lying on the floor, breathing through a pen. Into that profound, cathedral-like silence stepped the Admiral. He moved with a quiet dignity, his presence a gravity, that pulled the room back into a semblance of order. He had watched the entire event unfold from his position against the far wall, his face an unreadable mask of naval discipline. But his eyes, the sharp, intelligent eyes of a man who had commanded fleets and sent men in a battle, had missed nothing. He had not seen a reckless act of improvisation. He had seen a flawless execution of a battlefield medical procedure performed under extreme duress with a surgeon's precision. He had seen the way Morgan's hands moved with an ingrained muscle memory that no classroom could ever impart. He had seen the cold fire in her eyes, the hallmark of every true warrior he had ever known. He walked past the stunned Commander Davies as if he were a piece of furniture, his focus entirely on the woman on the floor. He knelt, not with the creaking joints of an old man, but with the fluid motion of someone still familiar with the deck of a pitching ship. "Petty officer," he said, his voice a low rumble of authority. "Report." He was not asking for an explanation. He was acknowledging her as the ranking medical authority on the scene, a gesture of professional respect that was as stunning as the procedure she had just performed. Morgan, still monitoring the Master Chief, looked up. Anaphylactic shock, Admiral. Airway was completely compromised. Performed an emergency cricothyrotomy to establish a patent airway. Vitals are stabilizing, but he needs immediate transport for a formal tracheostomy and observation. Her report was concise, clinical, and completely professional. She used no jargon to impress, no dramatic language to embellish. It was the voice of competence, pure and simple. The Admiral nodded, then his eyes flickered down to her forearm, where her sleeve had ridden up during the chaos. He saw them, a network of fine, silvery lines, almost invisible against her skin. They weren't the clean lines of a surgical scar. They were the jagged, chaotic patterns left by shrapnel, the deadly autograph of an improvised explosive device. They were the stigmata of her profession. He had seen scars like that before, on the limbs of the bravest men he had ever had the honor to command. They were a map of survival, a testament to a trial by fire. He stood up, his expression hardening as he turned his gaze back to the now trembling Commander Davies. The Admiral's silence was more damning than any reprimand. He simply held out his hand. "Her file, Commander." "Now." Commander Davies fumbled with the records jacket, his hand shaking so badly he could barely get a grip on it. The slick confidence he had worn like a second skin just minutes ago had evaporated, leaving behind a pale, sweating man stripped bare of his arrogance. He handed the file to the Admiral, avoiding eye contact, his gaze fixed on the floor as if hoping it might swallow him whole. The Admiral took the file and opened it. The room remained utterly silent, the only sound the steady, life-giving hiss from the pen in the Master Chief's throat and the distant, approaching wail of sirens. The Admiral didn't need to read the whole file. He knew what he would find, but he performed the act for the benefit of the room, for every sailor and Marine who had witnessed the event, and most of all, for the humbled commander. His eyes scanned the first page, and he began to speak, his voice calm, but resonating with an authority that turned the dry, bureaucratic data into a litany of honor. "Petty Officer First Class and Morgan," he began, his voice cutting through the tension. "Date of enlistment, 12 years ago. Primary military occupational specialty, Special Amphibious Reconnaissance Corpsman." He paused, letting the weight of that title settle into the room. It was one of a handful of the most demanding medical ratings in the entire U.S. military. He continued, his voice like a judge reading a verdict. "Assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group." A low murmur went through the crowd. "DevGru, SEAL Team 6, the quiet professionals, the legends, the ghosts." This unassuming woman was one of them. The Admiral's eyes continued down the page. Deployments. Operation Iraqi Freedom, 4 tours. Operation Enduring Freedom, 5 tours. He listed the locations like a roll call of hell on earth. Fallujah, Ramadi, the Karengal Valley, the Sanjin District. Places whose names were synonymous with the fiercest fighting of the modern era. He then reached the section for awards and decorations. Awarded the Silver Star for gallantry in action, exposing herself to heavy enemy fire to render life-saving aid to 3 wounded teammates. His voice grew quieter, more reverent. Awarded the Navy Cross. The room seemed to shrink. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. For extraordinary heroism while under attack from an overwhelming enemy force. After her team leader was incapacitated, Petty Officer Morgan assumed command, directed suppressive fire, and single-handedly repelled an enemy assault, while simultaneously treating multiple critical casualties, saving the lives of the entire element. He closed the file with a soft snap that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He looked at Morgan, who had now been relieved by the arriving paramedics, and was standing, wiping the Master Chief's blood from her hands with a sterile gauze pad. The Admiral stepped in front of her. He did not offer a handshake or a pat on the back. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and executed a perfect, razor-sharp salute. It was not the casual salute one gives to a subordinate. It was the salute of a warrior to a warrior, a gesture of profound and absolute respect that transcended rank. "Petty Officer Morgan," the Admiral said, his voice thick with emotion. "On behalf of the United States Navy, my apologies for the reception you received here today." Then he turned to the ashen-faced Commander Davies and the rest of the stunned onlookers. "Take a good, long look," he commanded, his voice now cold as steel. "This is what a hero looks like. Assumptions are a luxury we cannot afford in our line of work. Today, that lesson almost cost a good man his life. Let it be the last time it is taught at this command." The story of what happened in Processing Bay 7 spread through the naval base like a shockwave. It wasn't just gossip. It was the birth of a legend. It traveled through the hushed whispers in the chow halls, the encrypted messages between operators overseas, and the late-night bull sessions in the barracks. The details, as they always do, began to morph and grow with each telling, acquiring the burnished patina of folklore. They said she moved before the Master Chief even hit the floor, as if she had sensed the event seconds before it happened. They said she hadn't used a letter opener, but a sharpened dog tag, and that she'd held the man's heart in her hand to keep it beating. They said the Admiral didn't just salute her. He had taken off his own command pin and tried to give it to her right there on the spot. The incident was given a name. Morgan's Crick. It became a new piece of naval lexicon, a shorthand for an act of impossible competence performed with surgical calm under unbearable pressure. A young sailor who aced a test was told he'd pulled a Morgan's Crick on the exam. A pilot who landed a damaged aircraft flawlessly was said to have made a Morgan landing. Her name became synonymous with excellence, a quiet, unassuming benchmark that every service member now aspired to. For Commander Davies, the aftermath was a swift and brutal lesson in institutional justice. He was formally relieved of his command of the processing center and reassigned to a records-keeping facility in the most remote, forgotten corner of the naval bureaucracy. His career was, for all intents and purposes, over. But the true change was deeper. 6 months later, a young female sailor, fresh out of boot camp and visibly nervous, dropped a tall stack of folders in front of his new desk. The old Davies would have berated her for her clumsiness. The new Davies, a quieter, more somber man, simply knelt down without a word and began helping her pick them up. He looked her in the eye and said, "Take your time. We'll get it sorted." He had learned, in the most humiliating way possible, that the content of a person's character and the measure of their skill had nothing to do with the vessel they inhabited. He had learned the Admiral's lesson. He had learned to see the warrior, not the uniform. And what of Petty Officer Morgan? She became a ghost in her own legend. She wanted no part of the fame or the adulation. The attention made her deeply uncomfortable. For a few days after the incident, she was the object of stares and whispers wherever she went, a living monument to her own actions. Operators, men who were themselves legends, would nod to her with a newfound reverence. Senior officers would go out of their way to greet her. She endured it with the same quiet stoicism she had shown Commander Davies, but she sought refuge in the one place she felt truly at home, the training rooms of the base medical center. There, the legend gave way to the teacher. She spent her time mentoring the young corpsman, the same kind of terrified sailor who had frozen when the Master Chief collapsed. She never mentioned the incident in Base 7. Instead, she translated its lessons into action. She would create scenarios of unimaginable chaos, with smoke, shouting, and multiple casualty dummies, forcing her students to find their own point of calm in the storm. "Don't listen to the noise," she would tell them, her voice low and steady as she guided a student's trembling hands. "Listen to the patient. Feel the pulse. See the wound. The rest is a distraction. Your hands know what to do. Trust your hands." She was teaching them more than medicine. She was teaching them her philosophy. Competence is quiet. Panic is loud. Your skill is your voice. Let's speak for you. Her humility was absolute. When the base commander held a ceremony to commend her, she simply said, "I just did my job, sir." The Master Chief is the one who fought. "I just helped." The letter opener and the pen she had used were retrieved and mounted in a simple black shadow box. The base commander hung it on the wall of Base 7, right over the desk where Commander Davies used to sit. The small brass plaque beneath it did not bear her name, at her specific request. It read simply, "Competence is a language of IT's own. Never assume you are deaf to it." It became a silent, ever-present reminder to all who passed through those doors. A year passed. The seasons changed, and the steady rhythm of deployment and homecoming continued. The story of Morgan's Crick had solidified from legend into institutional doctrine. At the Naval Medical Training Institute, a new module had been added to the curriculum for all corpsmen. It was officially designated Advanced Battlefield Triage under Duress, but everyone called it the Morgan Protocol. It was a brutal, unforgiving series of simulations designed to break down a medic's reliance on ideal conditions and perfect equipment. Trainees were forced to perform complex procedures in pitch darkness, with blaring sirens, and using only improvised tools they could find in the room. The goal was not just to test their medical knowledge, but to forge their minds into instruments of calm, to teach them how to filter out the noise and focus on the signal, just as Morgan had. The protocol's final exam was a recreation of the Bay 7 incident, complete with a hyper-realistic mannequin and a condescending officer-actor designed to provoke and distract them. Most failed their first time, but those who passed emerged with a new kind of confidence, a quiet professionalism that was instantly recognizable. They had learned the ultimate lesson, that the most important tool of medicaries is not in their kit, but in their character. The shadow box in Bay 7 was now a mandatory stop for all new personnel checking into the command. A grizzled master gunnery sergeant, a man who had seen everything, would take the newcomers to the spot. He wouldn't tell the whole dramatic story. He would just point at the box. "Look at that," he'd say, his voice a low growl. "A pen and a letter opener. Tools for an office. In the right hands, they save the life of a master chief. In the wrong hands, they're just junk. Remember that. It's not about the gear you carry. It's about the competence you've earned. Your rank, your size, your gender. None of it matters when someone is bleeding out. The only thing that matters is whether you can stop the bleeding." The lesson had become part of the command's DNA. The arrogance that had allowed a man like Davies to flourish had been excised, replaced by a culture of earned respect. They learned to look for the quiet ones, to recognize the subtle cues of the true professional, to understand that the most dangerous people on any battlefield are often the ones you never see coming. The true legacy of Petty Officer and Morgan was not the single, dramatic act of saving a life. It was the thousands of lives that would be saved in the future by the corpsmen she trained and the culture she inadvertently changed. Her legacy wasn't the medal she was awarded for it, a medal she kept in a shoebox at the bottom of her locker. It was the standard she set. It was the quiet, unyielding expectation of excellence that now permeated the command. True strength, the base had learned, is not proclaimed in a loud voice or displayed in a powerful physique. It is demonstrated in the steadiness of a hand in a moment of chaos. It is proven by the quiet competence that requires no audience and seeks no applause. Respect is not a function of insignia on a collar. It is the currency of action, paid in full by those who do, while others talk. Petty Officer Morgan herself was long gone from that base. She had received her orders and shipped out for another deployment to another place where her skills were needed. She left as quietly as she had arrived, a small figure with a heavy pack, merging into a line of other operators, becoming anonymous once more. That is how she wanted it. She was a professional, a warrior, a healer, a ghost. Her story, however, remained. It became a foundational myth, a teaching parable for a new generation, a reminder that assumptions are the enemy of readiness, and that the most profound strength is often wrapped in the quietest silence. Her actions that day created a ripple that would continue to expand long after she was gone, a ripple of humility, respect, and an unwavering belief in the power of demonstrated, undeniable competence. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.